All right, Thomas. Week one is almost done. We have all this data. We have all this information. We have some of our questions answered here. Here we're at episode 101 of the Sumer Sports Show. I'm Eric Eager. I'm joined by Thomas Dimitroff. Wow, what a fun, interesting weekend of football. First impressions, go.
Look, I was really focused on the quarterbacks, the starters, the new ones, the 1 and 2 year guys. I mean, across the board, of course, quarterbacks are the driving force here. But to me, there were a lot of quarterbacks that were going to set the tone for, again, you know me, always come back to the team builders, set the tone for how it's going to be, who's going to be hot, who's going to not be hot. And it's going to be really interesting watching that. I loved the first week. I loved it. And look, all of us Giants fans and friends, and I have good friends on the Giants side, but I'm also a true homer with Dan Quinn, the way that he came out and played that game, man. That final game, I went to sleep. I literally could not go to sleep. I'm sitting there thinking about, just how Dan was dialing them up, and it was just a fun game to watch from a Cowboy perspective.
Yeah, it's funny because I've gone over these numbers a lot because from 2008 to 2012, no one on a per pick basis drafted better than you as far as value, right? And yet your tenure in Atlanta was very offensive friendly, right? I think if you look, we're going to talk a little bit about EPA. That's just a good way to measure offense that's maybe a little bit more granular than yards per play. From 2008 to 2020, when you were the general manager, the Falcons were 5th in expected points per play on offense. Kind of in the bot, but at the same time, the Falcons, when you were there, had a top half of the league defense early, but then in the second half of your tenure, you were very much offensive focused. Whenever you watch Dan with those defensive players, right? And again, it's not to say that you didn't draft well. Like I said, you drafted well. Just a lot of your hits were on offense. When you watch Dan Quinn out there with Micah Parsons, DeMarcus Lawrence, Mazi Smith from first round pick, the linebackers that off the ball, like the corners, they got Trayvon Diggs with the perfect Trayvon Diggs play. He gets beat, right? He chases the guy down, strips the ball, right? It's just like classic him. Gilmore on the other side now. They got safeties with Curse and Hooker and all those guys that are really good as well. Like, do you ever does that, because you guys drafted well defensively, like in 16, for example, you got Keanu Neal and Devondre Campbell and guys like that, but I don't think the league really has that many defenses that have that much talent. And then you pair that with Dan Quinn. What does that make you think about, given your history with him?
It always takes me back to the fact that I had two really, really top-notch D coordinators as head coaches, Mike Smith and Dan Quinn, specifically Dan right now. And we could never get our D going as much as it should have gotten going, right? I mean, we did in 16. We were running like crazy. No one could keep up with us really as far as athleticism and speed. But when I watch him now and I watch him dial it up and he's got some studs across the board, he gets Gilmore in there that he's really excited about as well. So back seven's operational. They're doing things in the secondary. The rushing passers are flying around. They have edge on them. I just watched Dan, and I'm so proud to watch him. And again, I think he's one of the very best coaches in the league, and definitely one of the best, if not the best, D coordinator. We talked about it the other day when we were trying to decide, was it going to be the Jets or was it going to be the Cowboys? Who was going to come to the table with the stellar defense? I think both of those, of course, are in the top 5. And again, the way that it was setting the tone for Dak Prescott in that game, I thought that was great. He had confidence. He was healed. Guys were catching balls. Guys were running hard. I mean, it was a fun game to watch. Again, only if you're a Cowboy fan.
Yeah, I watch that team and I think about it's funny because like we at Sumer, we're trying to codify and make more scientific kind of everything. And I was talking to a friend who in the league yesterday, and they were talking about how when they were evaluating Micah Parsons, they had him listed as an off-ball linebacker. And so like a lot of the models were like, and I even look back at my own, and again, I don't evaluate these guys like a scout would. I look back at like my own big board, and I had him like maybe 20th because of the positional value thing. And now he was telling me that like there was some like, well, why didn't we like him more and all this kind of stuff. It's like, the whole league misevaluated him, including Dallas, right, who had him playing inside line, off-ball linebacker early in his career, and now he's one of the premier edge players in all of football, like a Lawrence Taylor type player. And it's crazy because, again, it's all about these little bounces, because you get that bounce to go your way, and now everything else is easier. It makes DeMarcus Lawrence life better. It makes the coverage better, all this kind of stuff. And now Dan gets to do. And the thing I gotta comment Dan Quinn on, and I know, I maybe wasn't as, I didn't have the metrics for this, but when I watched Falcons games back when you guys were together, he may have just not simply had the personnel to be as creative, but he is the most creative defensive coordinator in the league right now. And it's crazy to watch him right now.
Look, I think this is really important to understand. I mean, again, 2D coordinators coming in, running the Atlanta Falcons as the head coach in a row, Mike Smith and Dan Quinn, both really creative. With the way Dan, remember, Dan was one of those guys, like all these head coaches, when they finally get their head coaching job, they remember so acutely, Eric, how it was to be the D coordinator or O coordinator, and how much of a pain in the ass it was when their head coach was all over them. Dan was hypersensitive to that. So he let his coordinators do their things. And at times it pulled back. He wasn't able to be the creative guy. Of course, he helped out. We had conversations about that all the time as head coach and GM. I'm like, Dan, get your butt in there and run that defense. Got to be mindful of our coaching staff, because that is what happens. And I get it. Now he's in there and he's able to be the dude and be creative with it. I think if Dan ever went back into being a head coach, he's not worried about the feelings as much. Last point on that. You get those head coaches out there like Sean Payton, Mike McCarthy. Well, Mike, there's certain guys out there. Mike's not probably a bad example, but Sean Payton for sure, amongst a number of other head coaches, they don't care if people have hurt feelings. They're going to do what's best for the organization. If they see a difference that needs to be done on the offense or defense, as a former coordinator, they'll run roughshod over that coordinator to make sure it's the best for the team. I think Dan's going to be very mindful of that when he gets his next head coaching job.
Yeah, and I think it just, at this point, it's a matter of when and not a matter of if. Fun fact, Thomas, the last time the Cowboys won a Super Bowl, they played the first Monday Night Football game of the year. They played in the old Meadowlands and beat the Giants 35-0. Going on the road and beating the Giants 40-0 this year, maybe it's a harbinger of things to come. That was Barry Switzer's lone championship after he succeeded Jimmy Johnson. But that is 1995. That was the last time the Cowboys won a Super Bowl. It started in very similar fashion. Interestingly, they beat a Giants team that in 1994 was 9-7. This Giants team was also 9-7-1 because we have that extra game. So just some fun NFL numerology there. I want to go back to the team that obviously Dan Quinn was the head coach of. You were the general manager of. We watched the Panthers go on the road and face the Falcons. The Panthers were closed about 3.5-point underdogs, so the market had given the Falcons a little bit of an edge there. The Falcons go and they win 24-10. I think there was a little bit of criticism on Arthur Smith, mostly from the fantasy football community, that Jesse Bates, his acquisition this year, had as many catches too as Kyle Pitts and Drake London, 2 top 10 picks combined. I tweeted something. I'm like, it looks like Arthur Smith is serious about giving the ball to the running backs and not the outside guys. But Tyler Algier and Bijan Robinson looked really good. That offensive line road graded a little bit, at least at the end. At the beginning, Brian Burns was giving them a lot of trouble. Not much out of Desmond Ridder. He only averaged 3.5 yards average depth of target, so throwing the ball downfield was not what they were doing with the football. But your attention, and I think rightfully so, was centered more on the Panthers quarterback, Bryce Young, who obviously they traded up for. They were without DJ Chark. Adam Thielen was a little slowed up in the game as well, so you didn't have a lot to work with. But Bryce Young yesterday, 0.198 EPA per pass. He was hit 6 times on his dropbacks, which is second among the rookie quarterbacks behind only CJ Stroud. When you watched him yesterday, Thomas, what did you think?
Well, that's a tough game to watch with a lot of emotion in it for me, and I always have to put the emotion aside, of course. I mean, staying on the Panthers side, I think, again, you go round and round whether you believe in quarterback rating and 48-8 or whatever it was, whatever it came out to, 20 of 38. I was more taken aback by what I felt, First game, I get it, right? I felt like the presence wasn't there as much as I expected it to be, right? Not only his movement, but I thought he was going to be darting some of those deep balls and dropping him in when he was out in the open, doing the things that he could do, being creative like you're going to be with, hopefully with the Panthers moving forward. They're going to be creative. Look, I am sure what they did, and a lot of times that first game for your first round quarterback, there's a lot of pressure. There's more pressure on him than any of the other quarterbacks in my mind. Not only because he's the first, but he's going in there. Everyone's talking about height, this and that, how he's going to process with everyone around him. Throws 2 darts into Bates. That's tough. And I just didn't see the combination of, excitement and even some of the, I don't want to comment on the play calling necessarily, but I just felt like the creativity of where I thought he could kick into gear a little bit more in the second half to bring it back. I felt like they were just being chill about it, making sure they weren't injuring him and not putting him in a funky spot. Versus, of course, they wanted to win. Don't get me wrong. I just didn't see that. I didn't see that sort of drive to want to do that. It was kind of like, all right, let's move over here. He was smart. He was throwing the ball out of bounds where he needed to throw it out of bounds and such. I guess I expected more excitement in the game from him, and I think they were just trying to chill him.
Yeah, there were worse first game performances. Like Tua, for example, was about twice as bad. Same with Brandon Weeden and Tannehill. Johnny Manziel, if people remember that, they got shut out in or at home against the Bengals in his first start in 2014. And then Malik Willis last year had, passing a really bad first start. Stroud wasn't necessarily in that category, but it wasn't pretty. It was among one of the worst performances, not one of the better ones. This is kind of weird stuff, but when I see a quarterback, his demeanor was a little nonchalant. And granted, this is coming from I got friends all around who are like, I like the over in this game. I think it's undervalued. So I'm watching that game because the total had closed at 40 and a half, Thomas. If they were to score another touchdown, all my friends would be happy about this bet. And so I was watching thinking they need to get their asses in gear here on some of these drives. And what I saw, and this is also something, and I know that it's probably nothing, but his helmet wasn't buckled half the time he was out there. It looked weird to me how kind of just nonchalant it all was. And it floors me because I do think Frank Reich is a good coach. I do think the infrastructure there in Carolina is better than the market believes. And yet we got that performance yesterday. And it's sort of funny because I tweeted out every Falcons Panthers game is the same. It kind of lulls you to sleep, and it's all and that felt that way. But then the Panthers not coming back and knifing the Falcons like they sometimes do was the only surprise of that game.
So you hit nail on head. Really good head coach. I really like him. I like what they're doing. I think Scott is putting together a good team. Fitterer as far as, and there's a lot of pressure. Scott's in an interesting spot now. He's looking at a quarterback that he put himself on the line on, and he wants to see him perform, right? The emotion that you have as a general manager when you make a big time pick like that, I can't even begin to tell you about it. And again, my dealings with that was Matt Ryan, and that was kicking out the gate, right? When you're on the, you're trying to draft that guy to recover, there's a lot more pressure on that, right? This isn't just the first year coming into a regime. There's a lot there, right? So to your point, I'm so used to seeing those Carolina Panther Falcon games, and I'm like, gosh, then I wanted to see at the end, I wanted to see edge, and I just did not see the edge there. I don't know.
Yeah, you see all those games kind of lull you to sleep. They're kind of a pillow fight at the beginning, and then there's a barrage at the end that you don't expect. And that game kind of went out, and maybe this is a mark for Arthur Smith and his team that the Falcons, because at the end there, the Falcons kind of win the games you don't expect them to and lose some of the games you expect them to. Maybe good on Arthur Smith for putting that game to bed, but I do think that a lot of that has to do with the Panthers' sort of lack of energy and nonchalantness. You bring up a point. I want to segue to another game, but I want to make a contrast. So Scott Fitterer, takes over as the GM a couple of years ago, 2021. Kind of has a shot, Matt Rule, right? Matt Rule was there first. Matt Rule's gone. Now they go Reich, and then they go to Bryce Young. That's different than what Chicago had, right? Where, Ryan Pace, who's now in Atlanta, drafted Justin Fields, trades up for him at pick 11 in 2021, and they go a year with him. The whole new regime comes in, coach and GM, same hire, right? They come in and they actually buy into Fields a little bit by trading that first pick. Now, Fields was similarly inauspicious on Sunday in that, it wasn't a great performance. It was at home. It was against a division rival. The entire offseason, all the narratives were about, the Bears had malpracticed Justin Fields and, by not building around him. Last year was a rebuilding year. They got to figure some stuff out. Most of it was positive. Again, we're talking about narratives here. And they bring in DJ Moore. DJ Moore catches 2 passes yesterday. I think he was only targeted twice. And the defense still can't get to the quarterback. The offensive line is still not necessarily molded. And what did you and I say on Wednesday? This team is not going to be good in 2 years. And my biggest concern is that they'll move off of Poles and Eberflus too early because expectations were too high. That was exactly what we said last week. That seems to be coming to fruition. And when I look at this Chicago team, I at least see from the perspective of Poles and Eberflus the opportunity to make another decision at quarterback if it isn't going to work with Fields.
Yeah, so very different, like you said, than what's happened in other places and what Scott's dealing with. Comes in, look, let's call it the way it is. Fields has a lot of potential. How long are they going to, how long are they going to roll with him? How long are they going to have faith in him? How long are they going to put him in a spot to continue to grow? Of course, I don't know. What was his QBR again? Just for basis, 78, 75, something like that in the game.
Yeah, when you look at like QBR from like the ESPN-ish version was about 27.8, meaning like if you got that quarterback performance from him every game, you'd win about 28% of your games. So that's not great. EPA per play was minus 0.22, so he basically had a similar performance as Bryce Young did as well, which is good. The one thing that really worries me, Thomas, and our colleague Tej Seth, phenomenal. When he was at Pro Football Focus with me, he wrote an article using this metric called completion percentage over expected, and Justin Fields had one of the best marks in the accuracy version of that, meaning like taking out drops and stuff. So when Fields was at Ohio State, he was one of the most accurate passers in the league. Now that he's in Chicago, that seems to have erased completely. Yesterday on his passes, and actually Brandon Brobst, who's messaging here, 3.1 average depth of target for Fields. So he wasn't throwing the ball downfield. The average throw Fields had yesterday was expected to be completed 74.5% of the time. He only completed 66.7% of his passes. So he's throwing it short. He's not throwing it particularly dangerous places, but he's not completing an otherworldly percentage of those things. And that's where I get worried if I'm Eberflus or Poles, when it's like we're setting this thing up for him to get easy plays, and he's still not completing them even at a league average rate. That's got to be worrisome.
Yeah, I was interested in flipping back over, of course, to because I think it's going to be important for us to talk about Love here. But before we go over there, yeah, it's complicated, right? As a general manager, you start thinking, okay, I'm in my second year, right? I've invested a lot. We're trying to put the right people around our quarterback, and you're sitting up there in the booth, right? And you're tapping your fingers and you're getting excited about it because you're wondering. It seemed as though the energy in the stadium was rolling yesterday, right?
Oh my God. I messaged like 2 weeks ago. I was like, I cannot wait till this game because the Bears, we remember them at the Super Bowl. They're only a month away from having, earning the first pick, if you will. And Bears, the ownership and all that, they can't really expect much more out of their fans. Bears fans showed up. Bears fans showed up all off season, even though they weren't very good last year. Like, this is a fan base that is ready for a good team. And again, that was one of the things that worried me was I don't think this is that good of a team yet. And fortunately for the Packers, right? Their quarterback understood the assignment. He wasn't Aaron Rodgers like at all. He was more, he was closer to Matt Ryan type, right? Where he's turning the back to his defense on play action. He's super accurate, super smart, making all the right reads. In fact, Jordan Love was aggressive yesterday. He had 10.2 average at the target. He's throwing the ball downfield 3 times further than Justin Fields is. He had an 87 QBR, meaning if you get that performance out of Jordan Love, you're winning 87% of your games. And I was very impressed with Matt LaFleur. I was very impressed. I mean, they were without their number one receiver that game as well. Man, that great. I think it shows the value of a guy like LaFleur, who has kind of been percolating under the surface as a great coach. I think he really showed himself out to be a great coach yesterday.
Before I go to the Packers, just quickly to finish up. Yes, there were certain things about Fields, by the way, bobbling of balls and just things not bouncing their way that always, to me, sets a tone where I'm like, oh my gosh, you have to have the ball bounce your way. You have to have the energy your way. You have to believe in the team. I wonder where we are with that. Flipping over to Green Bay. Let me just say this, first of all, back to head coach and general manager making a big time move, right? Jordan Love coming in, not truly really sure where they are. Really good game plan. I thought that they were moving it around with such confidence, even though, like you said, it wasn't, Aaron Rodgers-esque, but he was dropping in some balls well. It was moving around. I just thought there was a presence there with that team that felt smooth for the most part. I mean, what did Aaron Jones run for, by the way? He had some rocking runs.
He had a 35-yard touchdown catch on a 4th down and medium, which was a really good LaFleur call that kind of put the game away a little bit. He had a 55-yard catch as well. I think he had like 86 yards receiving on 2 catches, and then he had like 40 rushing yards. But he didn't play the whole second quarter. Packers fans were still kind of angry about, you had this A.J. Dillon who is this big, fast, strong thing that has a lot of good measurables but hasn't really performed. And then you have Jones, who's clearly better. But we did see him kind of hold his hamstring after that long run. I think that they want to limit him so he doesn't get injured. But Aaron Jones, if he never got hurt, would be a top 5 running back in the NFL. I think it's not particularly close. He was fantastic yesterday. And I thought it was interesting that they singled him up on one of the 2 linebackers that Eberflus signed in free agency as well on that 4th down on the arrow route. And it kind of it was no match. And that's just, again, I think LaFleur really did a good job of putting that together. One other thing, and this is for the Brian Gutekunst. Both lines for Green Bay outclassed the Bears by a country mile. The defensive line for Green Bay, like Rashawn Gary tore his ACL last year, had to sit the rest of the season. He only got 10 snaps yesterday. He got a pressure on 5 of those, right? They got Preston Smith on the other side. They got Devontae Wyatt in the draft. Quay Walker, a guy who struggled last year, right, playing linebacker, first-round pick out of Georgia, gets a pick 6. Then on the other side, Bakhtiari, after basically sitting for 2 straight years, he looks healthy finally again. And Jordan Love, he got pressured twice yesterday, right? And some of that's the Bears not having anybody to rush the passer. And some of that is, sometimes it's about winning at the line of scrimmage, especially if your quarterback is kind of in that mid-tier. And the Packers knew that too.
Pressured twice, you say. Think about that. You look at some of those other games where the pressure was coming like mad. As much as I was very impressed with Jordan Love's first outing, and I was impressed by the way they put it together, you start dialing up the pressure is when I really will make that comment. So we'll come back to this again, because I'm still waiting to see if he is the dude that, they think he is. And we'll see how it plays out. And I've told you this time and again, it's not just about the smooth balls and moving around. It's about how he's going to lead when things get rough, and they can get rough quickly, as we know.
Yep, for sure. And from what I can tell, Love leadership type is more quiet than some of the more rah guys, and that's important to know. Speaking of a guy who had more of a rah leadership style, but it wasn't as effective. Baker Mayfield went into Minnesota yesterday and won a football game. Now, Kirk Cousins put up phenomenal stats. A lot of the first half. The Vikings were spurned by 3 turnovers. One was a fumbled snap. One of them was a guard landing in Kirk Cousins' lap. And I mean, it was exactly the kind of performance that was the opposite of what you got from the Vikings last year, right? Where the game was close, and they were the ones that made all the silly mistakes. Last year, the other teams were the ones that made the silly mistakes, and so they lose. Baker Mayfield, I think they showed kind of the formula that you need to win with him at quarterback. Only, I believe, 4 completions on passes that traveled more than 10 yards in the air. But the underneath stuff worked a lot, and they have really good wide receivers in Evans and in Godwin, and that kind of really did help them against a Minnesota defense. We're going to talk about their draft from a year ago and why their defense isn't quite as good as they want it to be in a second. But when I watch Baker play, I don't think it's much different than what I expected him, but they ended up getting a win. So good on him for at least starting out this Tampa Bay career in a decent spot.
So do you think this comes back to Jason Light decision to go with Baker? And he's got a soft spot in your heart. I know that. You always want to continue to talk about Baker Mayfield. I mean, halfway through the season, back to, what was it? Only how many? No passes over 6 or over 10, right?
So he only completed one ball. I mean, he completed a long touchdown in the middle of the field to Evans at 28 yards. That was his only pass that traveled more than 20 yards in the air. He only had another 3 completions that traveled over 10. Now, he only took, 10 passes that were over 10 yards in the air. So they weren't trying him down the field much, but touchdown over the middle. But he was very accurate. I mean, he only had the 3 incompletions otherwise, on 0 to 10. And again, that's probably, if you think about Jason Light, right? Let's be really honest about where they're at. $75 million in dead cap money this year, right? That's paying the bill for the Super Bowl that they won, right? That Super Bowl that no one's going to take away from them. That Super Bowl that's real. That Super Bowl that we all want, right? And so this year they bring back Jamel Dean. They bring back Levante David. Devin White had a really good football game that game. They rushed the passer pretty well with Vita Vea, Shaq Barrett, Joe Shoyinka. There's pieces there, right? And I think a team like Tampa Bay is going to be okay until their players start getting hurt, right? I think that the thing that Light was up against was not necessarily bringing in 22 adequate starters. It's with $75 million less dollars than everybody else has. It's the reserves, it's the lines, it's all that stuff where if they get lucky and stay healthy all year, this team's going to be competitive. And I think Baker Mayfield is part of that trick. When Baker was healthy in Cleveland in 2020, they made the playoffs. When he was injured, he was one of the worst quarterbacks in football. So I actually, when I watched that game, I'm like, this Tampa Bay team, and we're not going to talk about this game in depth, Tampa and Los Angeles, the Rams, those teams showed out, I think, a much, much more than the markets thought they were going to in very impressive fashions. And I think, Todd Bowles as well as Sean McVay deserve a lot of credit for their performances.
I agree with you 100% on that. And back to Jason Light quickly. He's a well thought out football man. I don't doubt that at all. They didn't just randomly say, let's just pull this, quarterback that we're not really sure with Baker being the guy. They know what they're doing there. They're aware of how they need to approach this cap related and how they're going to build in the future. And like you said, I think both the Bucs and the Rams came to play, and it'll be fun to watch how they play out within their divisions, because I think they're going to be battling. And that, both of their divisions, right? I mean, let's go to the NFC South here for a minute. I mean, I'm sitting there watching. I'm like, okay, who's going to take it? I mean, this is way early, but I mean, the quarterback situation is all over the place. I mean, we didn't really talk about the Falcons that much. And Desmond Ridder, I mean, he was getting, he was edgy early on. Obviously, they didn't throw down the field much. I think before they even knocked that one out there to Kyle Pitts. Which, how many targets did he have, by the way? Pitts.
I know he caught 2 balls. I think it was probably, 3 to 4 targets. It wasn't much.
I thought he was only, before that ball, I think he was sub 75 total yards passing. He was 11 of 15 or whatever. My point,
all that was the backs.
That was the backs.
All the backs, right? He wasn't throwing to wide receivers and tight ends. I mean, it was all running back stuff.
And so what I'm saying is, that's going to be interesting to see how it plays out, where the quarterbacks are, who's going to shine. We're not talking about the Saints necessarily today, but, where is that going to be? And I guess I'm referring to it because I know how tough it was over the years when we were in that division. There were some stud quarterbacks to deal with. now it's going to be pretty interesting up
Yeah,
in
it
the
was
air.
funny because like when James Bradbury left the Panthers and went to the Giants, like his PFF grades all went up, and it's like, yeah, because he doesn't have to face Mike Evans, Julio Jones, Roddy, like all the guys in your that was a great, that is a great division. It's not on the level, but you think about it right now. Let's look at week 2 just briefly.
Yep.
A week from tonight, the Saints go to Carolina and face the Panthers. They're 3.5-point favorites on the road. We're not betting, but I would never, ever, 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 ever lay points with Derek Carr on the road against any NFL team, let alone his new Saints team, after how choppy that offense looked. They have some good players and they made some big plays. They could not block Tennessee yesterday. And that was a tough one. So that's a big game, right? If the Panthers win that game, then they're both 1-1. And then the Falcons host the Packers this week, two teams we just talked about. The Falcons, the Packers are 1-point favorites on the road. I think that's maybe a little bit of an overreaction to what we saw yesterday, but that's going to be a close game. And then Tampa hosts the Chicago Bears. Like, it's all cyclical. All these teams are talking about the same. The Bears were 2.5-point favorites before yesterday's game. Now they're 2.5-point underdogs after what we saw. So again, but there's nothing saying that the Bucs can't start the season 2-0 now. And then now all the team that everybody thought was going to be last place in this division starting 2-0, and possibly everybody else is 1-1 or worse. And that's a really kind of crazy sort of event. I do want to stay on this Vikings-Bucks thing just for a second, because you have, I think, tremendous insight here. And Sean actually had a good point here. Sean Donahoe, he said, draft models love Kwesi trading down from 12 to 32. Curious Thomas's thoughts on the big move and the balance between premium picks and bites at the apple. And this segues wonderfully into what I saw yesterday, which I just took a look at that first draft class of the Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, Kevin O'Connell era. That first pick was pick 12. That was the Jameson Williams pick. Now, Jameson Williams hasn't ended up doing anything, so, you could say whatever. But Lewis Cine was his first pick. Lewis Cine yesterday, the Vikings started 3 safeties, Josh Metellus, Cameron Bynum, and Harrison Smith. Lewis Cine is not one of those 3 safeties that is starting, does not play a snap on defense in that game. Andrew Booth, who was the second-round pick, they actually traded up for him. Andrew Booth sat not only behind, Byron Murphy, who they acquired this offseason, Caleb Evans, who was drafted 2 rounds below him, started over him. Mekhi Blackman, who was a draft pick this year on day 2 or 3, started over him in the nickel. Andrew Booth played 0 snaps on defense. So your first 2 picks of that draft are not playing anything other than special teams. Brian Asamoah, 3rd-round pick, who they had slated to start, he lost his starting job before the game. I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, and like I said, we're rooting for Kwesi. We want, I'm a big fan of his, but this first draft, I mean, it's going to go down as a clunker unless some things really change, and it's just hard to see them changing. How do you, as a team builder and evaluator, how do you kind of keep your confidence, keep your, how do you make sure that this is just a blip on the radar and not what defines you as a general manager?
It's hard not to think it's going to define you as a general manager. When you pick these players and the people that you have who have, stamped the table for them or pounded the table for them, there are some really good guys within that organization who understand putting talent together. This comes back to what I've said time and again. If they're not developing fast enough, before you know it, 2 years get in, 3 years get in, and they're not reaching their potential. They have an injury along the way. Let's just say they're a little bit slow to develop, from last year. And then all of a sudden there's an injury or 2, and then they're behind. And all of a sudden you're coming into, 2 and 3 years for these guys. And, they're kind of pushed aside. It's a really interesting game. It's unnerving at times because as a GM, you want all your dues to play. You want to do your part as a general manager, right? You're not calling plays. But Kwesi wants to make sure that he's evaluated by his ownership group. He wants the team to believe in him as a picker, so to speak, an acquirer guy. He wants his coach to have faith in him, obviously. And when things are kind of up and down on that and you're not getting the production out of it, it's an uneasy feeling. You go home at night and wake up in the morning, as much as you tell everyone, I'm not listening to the media, BS, don't care about it, don't care. When you're a human, You are concerned about it. And to me, it comes down to how are you developing them? That's when I would get upset at times as a GM, and I would spend time talking to the assistant coaches appropriately. Where are you with the development of these players? Because it is on them too. It's not just they come in and all of a sudden they're who they are. This has to be on the position coaches and the coordinators as well.
Well, and I think that not to go on a rant here, but I think that is part of the negative externality of kind of the armchair GM thing, where like we love the draft. The draft is this amazing spectacle. It makes the league a lot of money every spring, but we also don't. When we're too quick to judge the general manager for things that are a collective responsibility, right? And it's a collective responsibility. There was a time last year when I was doing my Chiefs podcast, and I was like, when's the last time a Chiefs player was a different guy than he was when he stepped in the building? And interestingly, the Chiefs brought in Joe Cullen to coach the defensive line, and you saw guys start, and to me, it was unfair to put all the failures on, and failures, the Chiefs are good, but like putting all like the individual missteps on Brett Veach, where it's like, no, he's responsible for getting you a player, and then you're responsible for making him good. And there were some players who like did not improve, and for a long time was the majority of their draft picks. And that's a team, as we talked about last week, that's phenomenal, right? That's a good team. And so you can imagine kind of like the disparities across the league. I will say this, interestingly for Kwesi, obviously Jordan Addison had a great game yesterday. That's his first round pick this year. So there's a win there for him, hopefully. They traded for TJ Hawkinson. He earns the biggest contract in tight end history. So I'm hoping again for Kwesi's sake that we grade everything he's done and not just the worst things he's done. And we make that into a, and they have success there. But this draft class, to your point, Thomas, like the last question I'll ask is like, when a draft class happens like this, how fast is too fast to write it off and start to plan for the future without them? And how much of you, as that person that evaluated them and put the magnet on the board, how much of you hangs on maybe longer than like the average fan? Because like, as somebody who watches the Vikings, I'm just like, look, the chances that Cine and Booth are any good are pretty much zero. You just got to move on. But if you pick them, you're going to hang on a little bit longer. And so what goes through your mind in that kind of situation?
Look, I was very focused on where retention rate was and in the right way, right? When we decided a player wasn't adept enough and talented enough, and look, one of the things that's really important for your head coach and your general manager is to know who the best evaluators are. You also need to know who your developers are. If you know you have a really good scheme guy at a position coach, he's really good on the board, he's a great guy, he's a great leader, but he's not a good developer, you better damn well do your part in trying to get someone else, the number 2 guy, to work with them. So like the number 2 linebacker guy, or the number 2 D-end guy, or whatever, you need to get creative with that. Because sometimes you're going to have coaches out there that are good in other areas, they're not good at developing, and then you are pissing up a proverbial tree, for lack of a better phrase. Yep. And that gets really complicated. It gets agitated. You get agitated as a general manager because you don't have a chance to develop. And before you know it, where you spent on this guy, so to speak, you're looking to trade him for a 6th and 7th round. That's not a good feather in your cap, man. That starts all of the banter about does this guy really know what he's doing as far as putting together the team?
Yeah, and that's a perfect segue, Thomas, to this other game I want to talk about, which is the 49ers went on the road against Pittsburgh yesterday. And I can tell you, every single sharp person I know in the markets was betting Pittsburgh. There's a group called Right Angle Sports that releases their plays. They had Pittsburgh first half, and that number moved from 2.5 down to basically a pick 'em at kickoff. And the Steelers were never in that game. And I think obviously this is the best way for a team like San Francisco, who's just traded, what amounted to like 3 first-round picks and all this stuff that they invested in Trey Lance. And that also includes having to move on from Jimmy G, right? So that's part of the Trey Lance thing too. Jimmy G was pretty damn good yesterday for the Raiders.
Sure.
And they move off him for a 4th-round pick. As you said, that's going to cause some doubts among people about, does John Lynch, does Kyle Shanahan know what they're doing? They go to Pittsburgh for a team that a lot of people like as a dark horse in the AFC on the road, and they on the road at 1:00, 10 a.m. Pacific, and absolutely mollywop. I mean, they killed them. And to me, it was another example of the 49ers have the line of scrimmage figured out. And the teams that had the line of scrimmage figured out on Sunday, the Browns, the Packers, the 49ers, all met or exceeded expectations. And I think that was a really good definitive statement for the 49ers to say, look, we had to sell off on a bad decision, but we're still here.
Do not underestimate. I know no one is the pressure of going in there after what we've already talked about on this pod a few pods ago, a big move on a quarterback miss and admitting that and moving forward and then getting Purdy in there. Can you imagine pressure on Purdy? Can you imagine the pressure on the organization if Purdy went out there and was kind of like just okay, pedestrian, and then Garoppolo does what he did? So this all came together for them. Kudos to John Lynch and Kyle for going with what they believed in here, because you watch that. Not only that, you watch Christian McCaffrey running the way he did, just the way they were playing, like you said, going into Pittsburgh like that with that kind of energy and that fire to go in there and run around, excited, explosive. I was impressed with it. I was not sure how are they going to come in after that. And I saw it on Kyle's face. And having been around Kyle as I have, I was wondering how in depth he was going to be and how focused he was going to be, given, I'm sure there was a lot of fallout by the local media as well as the national media, on what happened with Trey. So that's good for them that they stepped up and did what they needed to do.
Yeah, for sure. It was a very impressive performance. And, our VP of engineering on my side is a Steelers fan. And I was texting him. I'm like, I really want to give you comfort here, but this is not like, I don't think this is turning around. And it was interesting. Kenny Pickett had some really good, moments last year, but it is good to go back in the data and say, well, where did that happen? And somebody talked about it this morning on Twitter. He's like, really bad first and second down quarterback last year, really good third and fourth down and fourth quarter quarterback last year. Some of that's unsustainable, right? Like you got to be able to win on first and second down. And the 49ers did that repeatedly. The last game I want to talk about before we go, this is another one where, you feel good when you nail predictions, like the Packers for us and, all this stuff. I tweeted out like 2 weeks ago, I'm like, look, I cannot wait to watch Chargers Fins. This is going to be a game. Like this is, the total was 50. If I could bet, I would have bet a house on the over. And the funny part was, it could have been better, right? Like the Dolphins take the ball, march all the way downfield, fumble inside the 5, right? And then they trade touchdowns, and then the Dolphins have to set. And every time the Dolphins settled for a field goal, Thomas, I'm like, oh, like you're giving too much to Herbert. And it was just one of those games where it was so cool to see Mike McDaniel, Tua Tagovailoa, just like perfecting that craft. And I want to actually bring up this comment because I think it was really good by Alex Hussey, I think earlier, where he said Los Angeles played man coverage at the highest rate of week 1, playing against Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. They also had the So anyway, so that's like on defense. They dared Tua to throw it over their heads, and he did, like repeatedly. And it was amazing. And Herbert was almost as good on the other side as well. Last drive was a little disappointing, but what a phenomenal game.
Phenomenal game. I mean, I loved watching Tyreek Hill. I mean, didn't he claim that he's getting guaranteed 2,000 yards? Is that correct?
Well, I think he wants that, right? And I mean, if he stays healthy, it's hard to imagine him not doing that. I think here's an interesting question, because I watched Tyreek play for the Chiefs, and at least early on in the Alex Smith era, there were a lot of passes over the top because people didn't respect Alex Smith's arm and all that stuff. It took about a year and a half into the Mahomes era where those deep balls were not happening anymore, right? Teams would just play too high, and they'd be like, you better beat us underneath because we're not letting this happen. Do you think that there's at all a little bit of, because Tua has a reputation, I think it's probably earned, of being a mediocre talent, right? And I'm not saying he's a mediocre quarterback, but arm talent, moving ability, all that stuff, that safeties just simply dare him to do these things? And because I have never seen Tyreek Hill get these single coverages on the outside as frequently as he got yesterday. and it was like they were daring Tua to beat them over the top.
I mean, that's a good assessment. I mean, and every time I turned around, I felt like he was coming together, with a throw that was impressive. Although I also saw him throwing from his back heel, and I was thinking, God, he's just. And then I just keep coming back to Mike McDaniel. I'm thinking, you put together a hell, of a plan. And I was just so impressed to watch how that team was coming together and how explosive they were. And I wasn't expecting that from Tua. In my mind, I'm thinking, okay, Tua, I mean, you got your new quarterback helmet, and I'm not being facetious, but you're not thinking about it as much because it's on his mind. And yet he was moving around doing his thing. Now, how much pressure? You don't have any pressure rate on him, do you?
I'll look it up in a second. The one thing I wanted to point out, because you went exactly to where I went with the evaluation, is no Teron Armstead yesterday. One of the things that I thought when I came, like, because I like the Chargers in this game. I thought the Chargers would at least win, by a couple points or whatever. The point spread was like 2.5. I thought that they could cover that, and they were covering it for a significant amount of the game. So it kind of was a coin flip either way. But no Teron Armstead on offense, no Jalen Ramsey on defense. And to win that football game on the road, now, granted, we all know that the Chargers don't really have a great home field advantage. That's baked into the cake. But that's impressive. Tua was pressured on 14 of 46 dropbacks, about 30%, which is about league average. Here's the splits on these. And I'm using PFF's data. It's like, you can use another provider. When clean, he was 21 of 31 for 345. 3 touchdowns and the 1 pick. When pressure, he was 7 of 14, but for 121. Like, he made big, like, when they blitzed or whatever, he certainly made them pay. And yeah, I mean, when he wasn't blitzed, he was 16 of 27 for 300 yards. So yeah. They blitzed 40% of the time. They ran a lot of man coverage. I just think that that's a blunder. And the thing about Mike McDaniel, right? We think about all these wonderkin offensive minds, Thomas, right? They all kind of have their moment, and then it kind of gets regressive for them, right? Sean McVay, we're not going to talk about, always kills the first half of the season, and then the second half of the season, it's not quite as pretty. To a much lesser extent, Cliff Kingsbury is that way too. Comes out of the gate, they start 6-0, then they fade. Mike McDaniel last year, for the most part, kind of faded a little down the stretch. Can he sustain this? Because the wonderkin offensive play callers, they pop up all the time, right? And the ones that sustain themselves, the Andy Reids, the Kyle McShanahans, they're rare. And so if Mike McDaniel can sort of maintain this for a few years, I mean, you're talking about a really good head coaching trajectory. And we saw a similar one, on the offense. We haven't talked about this game, but I thought Ben Johnson for the Lions that called a really good game on Thursday as well. 2 guys that were fantastic last year calling plays, that there's questions about them kind of because they have a similarly talented quarterback in Goff and Tua. And both of those offenses, in my opinion, punched above their weight class on,
I agree. And I think the acquisition or, the bringing in of Vic Fangio, I think was a really good move for Mike. Takes his mind off that. I know we're talking about offense here, but as a head coach, to have a veteran like that with Mike as a youthful coach is going to be a really important acquisition, so to speak. It was fun to watch him dial it up at the end there when they needed to dial it up. I mean, I'm a big Herbert fan, but the way that they came, I was so impressed with it. I just thought it was such a fitting end.
Yeah, 100%. I think one of Herbert, like I said, Herbert, to your point, is a top 5 talent at the position in the league. The one weakness he does have is I think he processes the game too fast. And what I mean is he's very good at diagnosing what will work and what won't work. But sometimes, and again, I can't believe I'm saying this, but sometimes you have to wait out the weaker options at the beginning and wait, because at the end of that game, you're not winning by dumping the ball off, right? I don't care if that thing's not open early. It's your only option. And like people talk about Cousins dumping it off against the Giants and all stuff. And like, well, it wasn't open. It's like, yes, at the end of a game, all of your options suck. You gotta find the best one. And I feel like sometimes he's so good at processing, oh, that's not open, I'm gonna hit my check down, or that's not open, I'm gonna hit my back. Or when it is open, he throws a prettier deep ball than anybody in the league. But it's like in those situations, I feel like he's got to hold the ball longer. and try to fit it in, a situation that could get him an interception. But to me, an interception is just as good as whatever happened at the end of that game, because they both lose you the game. So you got to take some risks. And I think that that's my one criticism of him, is I just think he gives up on plays too quickly and checks the ball down a little bit too fast. And we saw that at the end. So this was great. We really like the comments. By the way, we have had more on the stream here than we normally have. So if you're new, please hit the subscribe button. Please hit the like button. We're coming to you 3:00 Monday and Wednesday. This has been an awfully fun just chat, and I can't wait for the game tonight. Before we leave, one quick thought on tonight's game. Buffalo goes to the Jets to face the new look New York Jets.
What quick thought? I mean, I just think the Bills are coming in. They're just going to roll, man. I'm not saying they're going to beat him up. This is a massively important thing for Joe Douglas and company. Of course, what they're going to do there, bringing in a quarterback as they do. I just look. I'm a big Albrecht fan. I've told you that. Just talking about the two big ass defenses that I think are going to roll. But I just think it's going to be a big Buffalo game, and they need this more than anything. Both of these teams do, right? That's why I think it's going to be a heated game. Are you looking for me to project?
Well, look, this reminds me, you talk about the NFC South. This reminds me of the Saints and the Bucks when Brady came in, right? Yeah. The Saints have kind of been on the doorstep. Bucks come in, early on, the Bucks got their asses kicked by the Saints. Like opening day of 2020, Brady gets picked 6 by Janoris Jenkins. I was working with Chris on the one where they lost 38-3 in Tampa to the Saints the year they won the Super Bowl. I'm with you. I think that Buffalo kind of shows the Jets who's boss in this game, I think, a little bit. And to me, if the Jets have the kind of ultimate success that they want to have, it's going to be gradual. It's not going to be, and it's important to realize, Rodgers, the one time he's won a Super Bowl was from the 6th seed on the road. Like, he's not been a very good 1 seed. He's a great, underdog in the playoffs. And I think that that's the role the Jets will ultimately have. And it's going to be because Buffalo has the upper hand early in the season, just like today.
The only thing, I think it should be a very good game, and there'll be the aggressiveness and comps will be crazy. I don't think that they're going to kick the crap out of Rodgers. I think I just think he's got to have the game that is expected of him. I really do. I still think a hell of a lot of Aaron Rodgers. And I think he can turn that offense around like crazy. So I just think it's going to be a great game for that division, right? Setting the tone again. I hope that they play out well and it's a close game and it's not a roughshod game.
Yeah, for sure. Because we got one of those last night. It wasn't particularly fun. And you do like to, sit down, have a glass of scotch and watch the game and not have to go to bed early. But this has been fantastic. Like I said, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, tell everybody that you know about this podcast. Hit sumersports.com for the latest in statistics, the latest in analysis. We got you covered. For Thomas Dimitroff, this has been Eric Eager. This has been episode 101 of the Sumer Sports Show.